Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Rose Dyson, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you here on behalf of friends of Egerton Ryerson. We are one of three organizations that is sponsoring this event today, as many of you are already aware. Canadian Institute for Historical Education and the Friends of Egerton Ryerson are both based here in Toronto, and the third sponsor is Macdonald-Laurier Institute based in Ottawa. We are here gathered, of course, on the traditional lands of the Wendat, Mississauga of the Credits, and Anishinaabe and other Indigenous nations who we acknowledge and appreciate interaction with. Before we start, I'd like to thank a few people for what they've done to bring this event to fruition. Bruce Weber for making this space available to us. Carolyn Edgar, who is handling the refreshments, and John Parker, who you'll be hearing from later, for his support, and for the Institute giving us very generous financial support to pull this thing together. But last and not least is, of course, Paul Bennett, who first had the idea of organizing this event to coincide with the Congress of the Social Sciences and Humanities. So out of curiosity, how many people are here because of the Congress as well? Okay, well that's good to know. We think we have a very interesting program for you. Some of Canada's leading historians, and I'm sure that they'll give you lots of important insights into writing historical justice and Egerton Ryerson with his enduring legacy. So over to Peter Copeland from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.
Thank you, Rose. Thanks so much, Rose, and thank you all for joining us here on a Sunday afternoon. Not too far from formerly Ryerson, TMU, so I think a good place to be doing this. My name is Peter Copeland. I'm the Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. As Canada's foremost nationally focused public policy think tank, MLI is committed to reasoned, informed, and nonpartisan debate about public policy issues and those that raise to the level of national importance. And we don't just analyze contemporary issues, but look to their deeper sources and engage with these deeper questions that shape our national life. Questions of identity, questions of memory and truth. And I think today's conversation will do just that. It revisits the legacy of Egerton Ryerson, not merely as a contested historical figure, but as a foundational contributor to Canada's public education system. His toppling and erasure from the public square reflect more than a revision of our past. They signal a deeper unease with authority, tradition, and the very idea of civic inheritance. And this trend matters to us at MLI because not only Ryerson was he a builder of institutions, but because his story reveals how far our public discourse has drifted from serious historical analysis. In place of evidence, we often find ideology. In place of context, just a rush to judgment. And we're very proud to support the work of Paul Bennett, one of Canada's foremost thoughtful education historians, whose new paper, Historic Injustice, challenges this drift and calls us back to clarity, rigor, and balance. And we're equally proud to have two of our senior fellows here alongside with him, Patrice Dutil and Chris Dummitt, who are also among the foremost Canadian historians. And really, MLI is what we are because of experts like them. And we're also pleased to co-host this event with the Canadian Institute for Historical Education and Friends of Egerton Ryerson, who I think share our commitment to a deeper and more honest understanding of Canada's past. And I want to just take this opportunity to kind of set the context a little bit, because it's more than just Ryerson, this event. It's about how we think about education, history, and authority. And there are troubling signs, I would say, with respect to all three. Pedagogical philosophy, has undergone profound transformations in recent decades. We've made many improvements, no doubt, but we've also shifted from cultivating knowledge and character to prioritizing self-expression, permissiveness, and emotional safety. From helicopter parenting, even I think there's bulldozer parenting now, to the notion that children are just these autonomous rights bearers, right out of the womb. Authority in the classroom, I think, has steadily eroded, and activism is increasingly replacing inquiry as the central mode of engagement. Grading, even, is sometimes viewed as punitive. Skill formation, is kind of sidelined in favor of vague notions of engagement. And, there are a lot of fashionable but unproven theories out there, chief among which is this idea of learning styles that, are just quickly embraced, even as empirical evidence of what actually works is often ignored. And I think the consequences are plain. Declining educational outcomes through PISA scores, rising classroom disorder, and a public education system increasingly unmoored from its original civic mission. And I would say that Ryerson, for all his flaws, believed in that mission. He believed that education could cultivate a shared moral and civic foundation, an idea we would do well to revisit. And at MLI, we believe that reclaiming history is part of renewing public purpose. And that history must be approached with honesty, not hostility, with a commitment to understanding and not just erasing. And that's why we're here this afternoon. We're here not to sanitize the past, but to ask whether a society that forgets its founders can long sustain the institutions they built. Whether we want to be a country that remembers or one that forgets. So without further ado, please welcome me in joining Chris Dummitt, our moderator, and our other esteemed panelists. Thank you.
All right, just what you need is a third person to introduce someone else. So I won't take up too much time. I'm very pleased to be asked to come to this event. I was very pleased that it happened, just as I'm incredibly disappointed, though not surprised, that there's not a single person from the Congress here to witness it and participate. In what? Oh, sorry. I very much apologize. I was sitting down. I didn't see anyone. And actually, from the size I had, I just thought it was zero. So I apologize. I'll buy you a drink later. All right. But my goal is not to do that. My goal is to introduce Paul Bennett. I actually only met Paul Bennett in person today, although we've exchanged contacts over the years. And mostly, I think of Paul Bennett as the author of op-eds and pieces I read in places like The Hub in particular, as someone who has just this refreshing perspective on education, someone who kind of puts cold water on some kind of overheated ideas. And so I always appreciate what he brings to the discussion of education in this country. So I was really glad that he can be here today. He, of course, is a leading educational policy researcher. You'll find him in all kinds of places talking about this. He just told me that the longest serving member of the Canadian History of Education Network, which I'm sure you're all members of, or you're going to become members of right now. But most importantly, also, he's the author of 10 books. Yes, double-digit numbers of books. So I think it's worth welcoming him here and hearing what he has to tell us about Egerton Ryerson.
Thank you. I wasn't going to use this podium, but I thought you wouldn't be able to see me. There's such a great crowd. Thank you so much for joining us today. What a pleasure it is to be here in the heart of Toronto, a place that Egerton Ryerson inhabited many, many years ago. But I think in many ways we're here to bring back his memories and to give a thorough discussion of what his contribution was. I've spent most of my career, 50 years, studying public education in one form or another. And there's one thing that ties it all together. Egerton Ryerson essentially established the Ontario school system, which in turn had a cascading effect on the rest of the country. And I've done lots of research on this. Trust me on this, it set the pattern for everyone else. Our timing could not have been better, because this past week, the Minister of Education, Paul Calandra, intervened and put a halt to the removal of historic names from Toronto District School Board schools. And you all followed that. And we all celebrate that, but the why is what we're here for today. Why did that happen? And what's next? Because we're good at relitigating all of this, talking about it, fighting old battles. We don't often shift the terms of discussion to what's next. So I have 4 recommendations that I'm going to share with you. I'd like to, first of all, acknowledge that this is an event that's a unique collaboration. It was intended to be town and gown, but the gown didn't show up. And that is one of the things I think that we need to work on, bring our academics back into regular communication with us, those of us that are out in the community. My talk is based on the 50-page report, which was released very timely in July when everyone was on holiday. So if you haven't read it, fine. But it's quite a challenge. Peter was one of my editors, and it's amazing it even got published because it was so complicated and many layered that we had to take a few runs at it to get it right. I think it tried to do too much, and I'm going to try to do some justice to it today. It's about Egerton Ryerson and his educational legacy and why it tends to be forgotten, or we focus on a few elements of his 32 years as the superintendent of education. We focus on one letter written for 3,000 words in 1847. This is essentially, in a nutshell, what my report is about. And it essentially says this, that there's a historic injustice that's been done. We hear a lot about social injustice, but we don't hear much about historic injustice. But I think you're here because you sense that there's room for this debate. There's room for, let's base it all on context. Is what's being said accurate? And does it truly reflect what we need to do? I focused on the 2 founders, regarded as the founders of the North American school system. Egerton Ryerson of Canada West, Upper Canada, and Horace Mann, who's reputed to be the founder of the American school system. I was always fascinated by this. Some of you know I teach education courses at St. Mary's University. I teach the foundations there. And one of the things I've concluded is that Horace Mann and Egerton Ryerson are fundamental to understanding the origins of the 2 school systems. My report found that, as you might expect, Americans show much greater respect for and are kinder to their heroes, including, I might add, Horace Mann, who's considered to be one of the most influential nation builders in the United States. He's recognized along with the founders of one of the great institutions in the United States. Americans have greater respect for and are kinder to Horace Mann, one of the most influential nation builders. Canada's misguided treatment of Egerton Ryerson represents a glaring example of historic injustice because it minimizes and casts aside his unbelievable legacy as the most prominent founder of our public schooling in Canada. But today I'm going to give you an added treat. I'm going to improve this report by talking about some of the recommendations that I put forward to turn things around. Because as you know, I'm not just a historian. I like to bring about and encourage change. The next slide, I think, is one that you'd find of interest, because these are the 2 most famous portraits of Egerton Ryerson and Horace Mann. These are the towering figures of the education systems. And going back to fundamentals in public education, if you really believe in public education, would you not have some interest in who founded them? Who founded these systems? Made them what they are, good or ill? You'd think so. But unfortunately, a lot of people who teach public education courses don't really put much emphasis, or they've eliminated Ryerson from the curriculum. But what I learned was he had a cascading influence on school systems around the country. Some of you know my books, Vanishing Schools, Threatened Communities, The Contested Schoolhouse in Maritime Canada, where I did an analysis of the origins of the 3 maritime school systems. You realize that the Common School Act in each of those provinces had an appendix. It was Ryerson's report. It was the appendix. The only rationale for the public school systems in those provinces was offered by Egerton Ryerson. Another thing that's interesting is the cascading effects of one leader who is the first out of the gate and others copy. Education, as you well know, is a series of repetitions. You know, it's 12 or 13 years repeated over and over again. There's a cycle. Education is very repetitive, so it wouldn't surprise you that there's a lot of repetition here. Now, I thought you'd be interested in the fate of the 2 monuments. You go to Boston, you'll see the monument of Horace Mann, still standing. It survived 9/11. They put guards around it, and they made sure that nobody touched it, and it's protected. And while there have been attempts to remove statues of those that were Confederates, and that's been quite successful, Mann is among those who stands. But look at this picture. By the way, I put that up on Twitter and I was blocked because you're not probably allowed to show Ryerson with a bloody head. It got blocked. So I'll just say this. We know just that one representation says it all. I guess I could rest my case. Maybe I should sit down while I'm ahead. Why not go a little bit more into Horace Mann? Look at this, how deification of Horace Mann. Classic number 1 of the American school system, The Republic and the School. Volume 1, 1956. Horace Mann's pictures on it. That's the founding of the school system. And you go through it, and there's it's really hagiography, and it's the man and the myth. And very much the myth is, I dispel the myths. You probably will be interested in the report because I actually give some critical assessments of man. Basically this, both men needed to be cut down to human size. Well, they didn't need to be eliminated. This is the best-known book on American education in the Origins period by Carl Kessel, who was the best-known educational historian of his era. And he just passed away. But Pillars of the Republic is really about Horace Mann. And you go into the details, and it's a bit of a critical piece, because Americans, while they do revere Horace Mann, they are not blind to some of the things he did, but they still acknowledge him anyway. It's just really, I think what we want. We want a fair acknowledgement of what Ryerson did. We want it, blemishes and all, but we don't want it gone, removed, and named, Memorial Metropolitan University, because we have to neutralize it and remove anything that might be the least bit contentious. The decline and fall of Egerton Ryerson is my topic today. It's very personal for me because when I went and did my doctorate at OISE, my professor was Willard Graveau. He wrote a book, which I'm going to show you. And it would be inconceivable to him that we would be talking about Ryerson being erased. He was a school superintendent from Prince Edward Island. He spent his entire career. He was the first person hired at OISE. First professor. And he revered Ryerson. He actually wrote the lead article in this book. By the way, the bicentennial edition from OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, you know that ivory tower with all the people that are on the left. Well, can you believe this? In 1984, this was their contribution to the bicentennial. The house that Ryerson built. That is the Ontario school system. I kid you not, look at that. That is, and Willard Graveau wrote the introductory chapter, which he repeated over and over like a catechism to me, and I knew it backwards and forwards. But there you are. The house that Ryerson built was the Canadian Education Canon. Some of you will know this, and I think embarrassed to say Lynn has helped me with some of this. And so, but I have to say that I want to go over some of the background, just to give you a sense of the accomplishments over 32 years as superintendent. When you look at all of these things, you know, the critical turning point in the establishment of a public school system in Ontario and maybe Canada, perhaps Canada, was his period in office. 32 years. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Because the origin of education reform was consistent with the origin of the school system. The two are very, very much in parallel. And this is, of course, the first history of schools and colleges in Ontario, and it's, of course, Ryerson's pictures on the flyleaf in the introduction. I teach this, so I'm not going to really, I teach this to my graduate students, the origins of the school system, but I'll just simply say this, that the Ryersonian model in Canada, West Ontario, was the founding model, basically the mold that the school system took. How original was it? Well, believe it or not, there's a master's degree thesis at Oxford University, which traces the origins of all of his ideas. Where did Ryerson get each of his ideas? Ireland for the Uyghurs. He went to Berlin and he got an idea for an orderly school system. For every one of his ideas there, we've traced the origins. It's not being taught now. Nobody's teaching this now to faculties of education. They're not teaching this because Ryerson has been obliterated, so there's no need to. But it shows just how he went and sought the best available at the time from around the world and brought it to Ontario. You know, the colonial schools up to 1844, look at what they were like. And then look what he brought. And I just want to go through this. I want to go through this because what else is there in Ontario education but a tax-supported universal system, pre-elementary education for all children, student textbooks, standardized textbooks, the first authorized textbooks, the establishment of teachers' colleges and normal schools. Yes, that conference they're at are now the normal schools, but they're not interested in discussing Ryerson, the founder of the normal school, and the first normal school in Ontario was where? Ryerson. The professional certification of teachers, teacher regulations, duties, responsibilities, local school boards, elections, school districts, compulsory school attendance, authorization of Indigenous residential schools. Well, really they were not residential schools, he wanted industrial schools. Recognition for Roman Catholic separate schools and school divisions, elementary, secondary, and collegiate. By God. That's pretty much what we have today. So, let someone deny that he's the founder. Well, they do, because they skirt the subject. And the forgotten Ryersonians. There were people who built their careers around educating us about Ryerson. For example, George Hodgins wrote everything about Ryerson. He cataloged all 32 years. He produced all of his letters. He did everything. He was basically the first deputy minister of education, recording everything. And then we have Sissons, Charles B. Sissons. And you know, the Canadian Historical Association is meeting right now. He won the Tyrrell Medal in 1952 on the basis of writing the history of Ryerson and Victoria College at U of T. So the evolution of our public school system from 1865 to 1982, those are some of the highlights. And these, I'm trying to give you a sense of what other turning points there were up to 1984 when this book was published. But I think the Ryerson period stands out. Well, where did he come up with this idea of industrial schools? Believe it or not, it was in Switzerland. On his tour, he went to the most progressive, most highly respected school for poor children. And it was the Hofwil School in Holland, in Switzerland. And he toured that school, and he was so impressed with it. He said that it could do wonders for the poor. And what he did was he made that connection between the Hofwil School, an agricultural school, and what would be best for Indigenous children. Now, there's lots of dispute about what he said about that, and I'm sure that others are going to be commenting on that. Now, is there not a connection between this? Because we know that Murray Sinclair, who headed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he spoke at Ryerson. I read the speech, I saw the speech, I took the transcript down. I thought, well, surely he's going to mention that it would be nice to remove the name. He made no mention of removing the name. He was asked questions and answers. No one talked about removing the name of Ryerson. In fact, I asked him when he was on his tour, what do you think about changing names? He said he doesn't think that's really that important. What's more important is an acknowledgement that reconciliation has to take place. He said changing the names is going to be divisive, he told me. Well, he's right. So the toppling of the Ryerson statue and the renaming of Ryerson, tell me if they're not connected, right? Because we had the chair of the committee. I was at the Canadian Historical Association at York University. I was doing a presentation like this to the Canadian Historical Association, and she was right beside me, Catherine Ellis. And one of the professors stood up and had the courage to say, how did you feel when Ryerson was bloodied and tore down the street? Do you think that was justified? Well, of course not. Well, I don't think she's repeated that anywhere. But that's the truth. So what's the report about? And I don't want to take up too much time because you're here to hear a lot of other people. The enduring legacy is there. It's the Ontario school system was founded by Ryerson and others, but largely him. And it was replicated in other provinces. I can give you chapter and verse. Without inflating or glorifying Ryerson's role, which I don't do, he shaped the system, and his 1846 report, which is called Public Elementary Education, still stands unchallenged. No one's really challenged the report that founded the system. That's the strange thing about this. There's a contested legacy. Those that want to take statues down, they believe that what's most important is contemporary values and how does it look to the public. And this is, I know all the people on both sides of this debate. And they say essentially that, it's what kind of an image are you leaving for future generations? So they talk about the current contemporary, and they skirt the issues of how we got to this point. But it is a contested legacy, as well it should be. But there need to be two sides for there to be a contested legacy. And right now in academia, there's only one side, and you're not on it, if you're here. So what are my recommendations? Very specific. What next? Let's not relitigate Ryerson. We don't have to. The evidence is clear. He founded the school system in many, many respects. Far too much evidence. So number one, he should be among the first restored and properly recognized for laying the foundations of Canadian public education, national. Because we're a provincially, education is a provincial responsibility, it never gets cast in a national. But all my research has, in all the provinces, has indicated that, because I wrote The State of the System, a reality check on Canada schools in 2020, and it shows how Ryerson was everywhere in the evolution. Second thing is we need to restore public monuments to, that's a first step in Ontario and Canada. You should see the monuments to Ryerson. They're totally inadequate. Basically, treat him like a man. He died in Toronto, it says. One of those there. He died in Toronto. Right. This is it. They want to be historically accurate, but they ignore everything. And you won't believe it says that he turned conservative towards the end of his term. And it also said there's some other things that, but essentially my report argues he should be recognized as a national historic person, and he should be given the kind of recognition that he deserves for founding the Canadian school system. I want to point out something. Ryerson should be debated and argued. This should be common, what we're doing today. People should be here arguing back and forth. Not over there, it's in the closet, we don't discuss it with that. Look what they do with man. They debate man all the time. They debate whether he actually, what kind of a system he created. Was it one that welcomed everyone? Was it a segregated school system? Why didn't he integrate the school system of Boston? All these things are being debated. Or is he still relevant? Is a topic that's discussed. And one of my favorite was the debate about what kind of school system was it. Was it a school system that believed in civic values or liberal education? We don't have those debates. They're having those debates right now. About man is debated because he's relevant to a lot of other things. Look at this pathetic thing. Look at that. Yeah, there's the Canadian flag. So, yeah, I thought you'd like to see that. The bigger challenge, I think, is reclaiming our lost educational history in universities, colleges, and schools. What is being taught to the current generation is not what you're looking at today. It's something far different. So my recommendation that there be a provincial inquiry into the origins and founding mission of the Ministry of Education. And when you do, you will find that there is no history without reference to Ryerson, and he plays a major role in it. So I think we should be recommending that there be an inquiry into the origins of public education so we can strengthen it, so we can retain it, and so we can build on what came from the foundations. Another key recommendation from me is we have a lack of historical consciousness among young people. I spent most of my career teaching history. I've got a few awards for teaching history, but one of the things I learned was over time, the narrative disappeared. And I think Christopher Dummitt has said, he's written in The Hub, and I totally agree with him, is that, some narrative is better than no narrative at all. And if the narrative is, I live in a society that's racist, that doesn't accept people, that's this, that's a lot of negatives. What kind of a society is it that we live in? We need to be talking about what is this society? And I think it's more British than American. I'll tell you that. But you never get anybody to say that. And so essentially this, we need to restore this shrunken liberal education core of educational foundations. And I'm very concerned about the lack of narrative competencies in today's youth. I don't think they know the story of Canada. And one of my friends is the leading historian in Quebec. And he, one thing I'll say about Quebecers, their young people know the story of Quebec. And we could learn a lot from them. Just what is the story of Anglo-Canadian society? We're not doing a very good job of telling. And narrative competencies. And luckily there are articles, books, Stéphane Levesque. But again, it's francophones working in Ontario telling us that our young people don't have any sense of our narrative. They're telling us we could do a better job at telling the story of Canada. Now, that's just my way of introducing our policy discussion forum. I'm going to turn it back to Chris. I hope I haven't gone on too long. Great.
All right, thank you, Paul. So if earlier I had bad news and that I was going to be a third person introducing someone, now I have good news, which is to say we thought that after a great introductory, let's say it's not an appetizer, it's more the main course was the appetizer. And then after that moment, we have a brief break. We've got some refreshments up here that have been nicely provided for you. We have a little moment of a break, and then we'll come back and have a fascinating shorter talks and some actual discussion where we'd love to hear from you as well. So we'll have just a 10-minute break here. All right. So that was the excellent warm-up, but the warm-up act wasn't the warm-up act, but we started in on Ryerson, a very impassioned defense of Egerton Ryerson's place in our public memory, and certainly our history of education, a sense of our history of our education system. Now we've got three other more esteemed speakers to give us diverse, different takes on the man, the controversy, etc. And I'm going to introduce them all at the beginning, and then they can come up in turn. And I'm going to introduce them in the opposite order from which they will speak. So I'll introduce the last person first, and I'll end up with Patrice at the end. So we're going to end up with Don Smith. Don Smith, who is really, I think, an eminent historian. Speaking of a great biographer of a number of figures, very generous, very skilled historian who's come all the way from out west to come and be here for today. Because, of course, he is also the author of one of his biographies, Sacred Feathers, the Reverend Peter Jones, Kakwanabe, and the Mississauga Indians, that was first published in 1987 and then republished in 2013. And also, he doesn't stay on this list here, the author of a great Ontario history article on Egerton Ryerson, which really, I think, is pivotal, kind of must-read material for this kind of issue. So we're happy to end up with Don at the end. Right in the middle is going to be Lynn McDonald, who is, I think, just a woman of all kinds of talents, and of course very involved in the Friends of Egerton Ryerson. Did you found the organization? Co-founded it?
Co-founder with Ron Stagg.
Co-founder with Ron Stagg. And also, I don't know if we can see it now. Oh, you can. She's wearing this medal. It's not on the material you've seen, but I've been understand this is the King Charles III medal that she just received for her incredible. It's worth clapping for the medal, but also the reason she got it, which is to introduce and get past the law which allows us to enjoy this event today smoke-free, which was the first of its kind. So thank you very much, Lynn. Okay, and we're going to start off with Patrice Dutil, a fellow historian who I always appreciate. I've read a number of his books, many of which are excellent, well, all of which are excellent that I've read. That was a terrible. Many of them are actually okay. Not bad. No, Patrice is a great historian. He's got, and also just incredibly prolific. He's the kind of man who makes me embarrassed to be a historian because I just don't publish as much as he does. So I'm envious and appreciative. And he is, of course, here to talk. He's written a really recent book, an excellent book on John Macdonald in 1885. He's written another book on the elections, just came out this year on elections of 1867, a really kind of often forgotten election. But he's also been a passionate spokesperson for kind of writing what Paul Bennett is calling moments or incidents of historical injustice. So we'll start it off with Patrice.
Thank you, Christopher. You can hear me, right? Thank you, Christopher. I want to thank Peter, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the Canadian Institute for Historical Education, and of course the Friends of Egerton Ryerson. I'm going to call him Egerton. I can't get used to Egerton. Blame it on my French.
Raise the mic.
Raise the mic. Here we go. Is this better? Can you hear me? Yes? Aye. Okay, here we go. I've been asked to be a commentator, and so I will comment on Paul Bennett, and thank you, Paul Bennett, of course, for organizing all this. I want to emphasize a slightly different Egerton Ryerson. When the Board of Governors of Ryerson University confirmed the idea that the university should abandon Egerton Ryerson, it also condemned the founder of OISE, the Wrong, OCADU, because all of those things were created in the mind of Egerton Ryerson. Egerton Ryerson was, of course, the founder of the Ontario educational system, the system that inspired, I'll say, for the sake of argument, that inspired the rest of the Canadian system, with the exception of Quebec, of course. But he had a profound influence far beyond formal education, K-12 education. Egerton Ryerson was also a humanist, and that's going to be the key point of our argument today. He's a humanist, far more than a Methodist minister. He was a man who spoke 3 languages. Let's not forget, he spoke English, of course. He spoke Ojibwe. He also spoke Latin. And in his time, Latin was the lingua franca, because he traveled a great deal, at taxpayers' expense, I'll say. That's to be forgiven. He had a purpose, and I'll talk about that. But I think it's important that we remember that Egerton Ryerson was far more than a teacher. He was a writer. He was an editor. He founded a newspaper. He founded one of the first publishing houses in Ontario. When he was called upon, when a university had to be created, Victoria College for Methodists, and I say this as a Catholic, he was called upon to do it. When you had to set up an educational system, who did they call? Egerton Ryerson, because of his remarkable administrative abilities. But I want to talk about the man as a thinker, as a public intellectual. a man who really is deserving of recognition, even though the university that once bore his name has decided to cast him aside, both in terms of memory and in terms of his memorial, and I'll finish my remarks with the memorial. But I want to talk a little bit more about his role as a humanist. And there are two particular missions. The first one was his drive for public libraries. It's often forgotten. Yes. Yes, ma'am. I have a fan. 2 fans. 3. There were, of course, libraries in Ontario before Egerton Ryerson became the superintendent of education. But they were small and they were private. The Mechanics Institutes, you may have heard about those. They were private. Ryerson made the argument from the get-go that we needed public libraries. The mechanism, of course, was going to be the schools, but he was emphatic that the schools had to make their book collections available to the wider public because it was important for the public to have access to education, to have access to those books. And he kept track of it. You know, the old saying in policy, if you don't measure it, nothing happens. He tracked it. In his annual reports to the government, he would track how many books had been purchased, how many books were in libraries. It mattered to him, and there was an explosion of public libraries across the province because of Egerton Ryerson. It mattered a great deal to him, and it spawned the idea that education was not simply for the wealthy, for those who could afford it. Education should be accessible through books. Again, let's not forget that this man is working in the 40s and 50s and 60s and in the 70s, 1800s, not the 1900s. The condemnation of the people around Ryerson University and at Victoria College, for heaven's sake, considers him to be a 21st century creature. He was a mid-19th century thinker. So the whole issue around public libraries became controversial. And, you know, again, Ryerson went about it in the way that you did things in the 19th century. He was very controlling. Let's not forget that he was a Methodist minister with certain Methodist ideas of what kind of books should be procured by the system. And he was very efficient, so he created a book depository. And his idea was, you know, if we can get the power of the province, the funding of the province together, then we can get the books for cheaper. And, you know, then we'll have them all in a warehouse, and then we can send them all to all the libraries. It was very efficient. Of course, it was also very controlling. And some of the liberals, I want to be fair to the history of Ryerson, you know, when the liberals started gaining strength and assumed power in Ontario, they got tired of Egerton Ryerson's rather controlling approach. So he fell out of favor a little bit as a result of that, because there was local pressure. Local booksellers wanted to sell to the library. Why is it got to be by, you know, think of the wine industry or the alcohol. You know, why is the government of Ontario in control of the wine industry? Well, the same thing with books in the 19th century. Why is the Ontario government, you know, controlling the books that go to the schools? All this to say, there was some controversy, but you can't run away from the fact that if it wasn't for Egerton Ryerson's catalyzing influence, we would not have had the stellar library system, public library system of that time, which has carried a legacy. I use the public library every day. And every day I think of Egerton Ryerson, because it was his idea that we should have a really well-functioning system. We're so lucky in Ontario. We're so lucky to have such a fantastic, it's his legacy. The second one, I said that he's the father of the wrong, and it's true. Egerton Ryerson did like art. As I said earlier, he liked to travel. And in 1841, he went to Europe, and his memoirs tells us that he traveled to all sorts of cities. He went to London, of course, Antwerp, a variety of cities in Europe. When he became superintendent of education and started the normal school, he decided that there should be a museum, that teachers should have, again, let's not forget, we don't have the internet here, where you can have images of everything at your fingertips. He needed globes, he needed maps, he needed microscopes, telescopes. He wanted to have some art. He made the argument that the government of Ontario should make sure that the students at the normal school would have access to that kind of visual resource. He convinced them to set aside the money. They gave them the money. He put it in his personal account. He made some money on the interest. Okay, this is the 19th century. I'm being upfront. I'm being transparent. There was some controversy there. You know, the Auditor General said, hey, wait a minute. Where's this money? Point is, when they put up the plans for the normal school, they made sure that the top floor, and this was a big school. I mean, it was where Ryerson is now, where TMU is now. It was a big, big school that took the whole, practically the whole block. The top floor would be dedicated to art. And so in 1855, Egerton Ryerson went to Europe, and he went to London, and his mission was, again, to buy scientific equipment and teaching assistants and teaching aids and stuff like that. And he met with a couple of people, and they said, you know, you really have to improve the people's taste. You have to elevate, you have to give them opportunities to see the great works of art. And so, you know, that corresponded with his ideas, and so he traveled. He went to the great copying capitals of Europe, because there was an industry in those days to copy the master works. And Ryerson winds up in Europe, and he's in competition with Harvard and all the school systems in the United States. And he starts to buy stuff. And he goes to London, he goes to Antwerp, he goes to Munich, he goes to Italy. He winds up in Florence, and in Florence, he meets this amazing guy called Antoine Sébastien Falardeau, a Quebecer, a 32-year-old Quebecer, who'd been in Florence for 10 years, and whose specialty was making copies of the great works of art. And Ryerson, this proud upper Canadian Methodist, hired the Catholic guy from Quebec to make dozens and dozens of copies. There's a bit of a controversy as to how many he ordered. We really don't know, because if you're wondering, where is this collection today? We don't know. We don't know. My point, though, is that Egerton Ryerson was very open to the idea, and not only open, but encouraged the idea that the resources for education needed to be put at the disposal of the public. And so when that school opened, when the upper floor opened in 1857, it was made available for public visitation, and you could see all sorts of wonderful paintings. A year later, even though there was some financial controversy over his 1855 trip, he was sent again in 1857, and there he bought all the necessary equipment for an Egyptian room. So it wasn't just a question, and welcome questions on this. I mean, it wasn't just the idea of broadcasting, I shouldn't use that expression, of importing colonial ideas or European ideas to Ontario. His objective was to broaden the awareness of the human experience that he knew best, and that is the Occidental tradition. But he wanted to do it because it was important. So, and he was explicit about that. It was about making sure the public, doing what you could to make the public aware. So when we think about Ryerson today, I come back and think about the monument that was destroyed. Apparently Ryerson University still holds the pieces, but they are in storage, and I'm deeply afraid that at some point, some university administrator is going to be needing warehousing space, and the thing will be put in the proverbial chipper. We cannot afford to lose this wonderful work of art that was his statue. The plinth that was destroyed needs to be restored, and they need to be reassembled at Queen's Park, where they belong, because Egerton Ryerson was a provincial treasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrice. Who knew we were going to get into art tax fraud? But I'm very pleased. All right, I'm not going to do another introduction without Lynn, please.
Thank you very much. Okay, two important points that would be useful in defending Ryerson. Next slide, please. The false accusations are based, the worst that he's accused of is that he had responsibility for the residential school system. He never even used the words residential school in any of his writing. There are 3 biographies of him. They're simply not there. Can we carry on? Oh, sorry. This is the accusation that he was responsible. He's now more than the architect. He is instrumental in the design and implementation of the residential school system. And then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is the plaque that's still up, and we're trying to get taken down. And it indeed reported that children were subjected to unthinkable abuse and neglect. But the TRC never accused Ryerson of responsibility for it. Indeed, that happened, but it's not him. And the aim of the residential school system was cultural genocide. I think that's a reasonable conclusion, but that wasn't Ryerson's aim. He supported the voluntary schools that were bilingual, day schools, entirely different. And the accusations are just really badly out of whack. Next slide, please. So the non-appearance of the words. Here are the 3 of the biographies that are available on him, and the assistant's 2-volume Life and Letters. That is there. His own story of my life, 614 pages. It's available on Project Gutenberg. You can search, and residential schools don't come up. Next slide, please. And then there are 2 doctoral theses done on Ryerson, one at the University of Toronto, one at Oxford, and neither of them have residential schools. They just don't get mentioned. He didn't work on them. He didn't advocate them. And then there is a master's thesis done at the University of Toronto on his correspondence with John A. Macdonald, then maybe Mr. John A. Macdonald. And so there are letters there. They never mentioned residential schools. They didn't discuss them. They discussed education and getting a decent system for Ontario, the regular school system. That's what they talked about, not about residential schools. Next slide, please. And so where there is discussion about residential schools, such as in this book from a conference held on Indians in North America, again, it discusses residential schools, but Ryerson isn't there because he had nothing to do with residential schools. And I think we have to be very firm about this. It's just a wildly inaccurate accusation. Next slide, please. Now, the term he did use was industrial schools. And this appears in his 1847 letter. Never call it a report, obviously, because it was a handwritten letter, not very long. And he was asked for it. It wasn't on his agenda. He was asked for it by an official at Indian Affairs, and he sent it along. And it does say that the pupils will reside together. And in the TRC report, it said, but he didn't say why. Well, it was obvious why, because they had to be on a farm, and the hours are long in planting and harvesting. And it had to be a successful farm. It had to be a large enough farm to add new buildings. There had to be a dormitory, a kitchen, a dining room, classrooms. They might need accommodation for the teachers there. It had to be a successful farm because one of the things that the pupils was to do the books. In effect, they would all do the books for the farm. Obviously not the substitute for the farmer and the farmer's wife, but they had to learn how to keep books because your farm will fail if you're spending too much money and not bringing it in. And so that was very important. The working day would be long. I don't know who would work out those long hours that he talks about, but Ryerson himself did. He was a farm boy himself, and he did it. But whatever, the pupils who were doing all that work, they would be paid for it, and the money would be put into a trust fund, and it would be given to them on their leaving the school, so it could help them set up in farming. And of course, the farming that gets described, that gets downgraded in the discussions about Ryerson, but in fact, he saw them as becoming prosperous farmers on their own account and overseers of some of the largest farms in Canada. He was looking for success. And he didn't want the word manual labor school. It's interesting that Methodists, Indigenous Methodists, wanted residential schools. They wanted them when the federal government didn't want them, that they thought the day schools weren't doing enough, and a couple were started. And Ryerson didn't really have anything to do with them either. He was busy on his job, and they were doing it. And however, they were not, they didn't work in the long run. They weren't given adequate funding. Next slide, please. So I think that we should be very clear that Ryerson did write in that letter about industrial schools, but they were not the schools that were built by the Indian Affairs. They just weren't. They were so very different. You can see, I mean, he lays it out. There is a curriculum. It's quite, it's a strong curriculum. In the summer there would be field trips. There's music in it. I mean, he sets out an academic program, and there it is. What happened in it? The residential schools that were built had the half-day system, generally speaking. The half-day system meant that the pupils only got schooling half a day. Regular children at regular schools got a day's schooling. But the Indian Affairs residential schools, they wanted to save money on staff, so they made the kids do a lot of the work. And so it meant that they didn't get much schooling. Now, they would do a lot of work in Ryerson's ideas of the industrial school, but they would be paid for it, and it would be farm work. It would be part of their training. It wouldn't be, cleaning up the kitchen and doing those things. Excuse me. So what Ryerson had in mind is very, very different, and I think we have to be firm. It had nothing to do with the residential schools, and the schools he did favor, I think not a one was ever built. I just can't see the pupils were supposed to be paid for their work. Did this happen at any of those schools? I've never heard of it. That pupils were paid. It was really very different. So the third point I want to make is something. New slide, please. Now, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and Ryerson, of course, lived with them and kept in touch with some of them. And he very quickly learned, he went in September 1826, that they wanted to have exclusive right to the salmon fishery at the credit in the lake, and they needed a clear title to their land. Ryerson helped them with learning farming. Government had built them some houses, but they needed to build the barns and fences and so on. And they were actually doing very well in that when Ryerson was there. But they had to move away because they could not get clear title. Ryerson worked on it. He met with people. He did it in England. Peter Jones did it and so on. Could not get clear title. And for that reason, they ended up moving out to these Six Nations. But what's interesting now is that the Mississaugas of the Credit have actually started in 2015 to try to get compensation for the land that was taken away from them, for which they could not get title. Ryerson worked on their getting title. Other people did too. He didn't have them, and they finally gave up. Next slide, please. So the province of Ontario went into the lawsuit. The class action suit started in 2019, and I don't know the background to all of these treaties and so forth, but it is quite interesting that they started 2015. They started to make a claim. It became a lawsuit in 2019, and just on March the 2nd of this year, the first payment went out, a $30 million payment, to show good faith in settling this claim. And on March 8th, otherwise known as International Women's Day, they offered to pay, I don't know if the payment's actually gone through, but it's more than $100 million in compensation. And it's an enormous swath of land that goes to the Rouge National Urban Park, but it will remain a park, but it's part of the contested land that the Mississaugas of the Credit should have been paid for. Next slide, please. I'm just about to wind up now. Okay. The arguments that Ryerson made back in his day are similar to what was made in the claim just all of this recently, that the fiduciary duty and the honor of the Crown depend upon compensation. That was said recently, and when Ryerson talked about it with the lieutenant governor of the time, he said the object I have is to show the amelioration of the condition of the Indians of this province, the importance to both the happiness of the Indian tribes and to the honor of the government. Using similar language because it's the same issue. But Ryerson was saying it 200 years before. And so we can see government is finally catching up with what should have been injustices long ignored and should have been. Next slide, please. So, as I said, he made those attempts. They came to nothing. Next slide, please. Now, the sneaky move by Toronto Metropolitan University and the Standing Strong Task Force, here's one of the sneaky things they did. If you look at their part 1 of the Appendix D, it's very favorable to Ryerson. But in part 2, it makes the Indian Act amendments his legacy. Well, how can it be his legacy if he never discussed them and never advocated them? It's just not there. They just, it's creative fiction. Next slide, please. Okay, restore his honor. This is what we're trying to do in the Friends of Egerton Ryerson. We're not trying to get the name back, futile, and they don't deserve it. But Ryerson should be visible on campus. I think a building should be named after him. And use his Indigenous name. You know, Indigenous students want to have a presence there. That should be done. And there should be a page on him on the website and a portrait of Ryerson in a prominent place on the campus. So restore his honor. Let's keep working on it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lynn. All right, we have now one more last but definitely not least speaker here. Very pleased to welcome.
Do you need to move the mic?
I do.
How are you?
I'm shrinking. I used to be 6'1". My 2 sons are taller than I am now. So part of the humiliation of getting old. Yeah, I think I don't know, 5'11". Anyways, that was Lynn and I. We just dovetail. This is divine because it's such an enormous topic, and my focus is very, very thin in this topic. My interest is really, I'm going to be quite honest with you, and put it all on the table. But first of all, I want to explain that my field. How's the hearing? Good. Everybody here? Yeah, we've got the height thing solved now.
As you can see,
How's that? How's that?
I'm screwing it, so let's no, catch it.
Hold the mic.
Can you do that?
Yes, sure I can.
Take it out.
Take it out. Okay, now let's go. So, wonderful. I'm the last speaker, and this is great because Lynn and I, we dovetail, and this is totally without planning, which is delightful. What I am doing here, well, I'm Don Smith, I'm from Alberta, and you need an Alberta opinion on this question, I'm sure. Well, what I do is history, evidence-based history, very traditional, and so that's the limitation of this. I have the highest respect for Indigenous studies. It's unbelievable. I studied the Ojibwe language for two winters. I know exactly the fantastic insights come through Indigenous studies. Please, I'm being honest with you, I don't do that. I do documentary historian. I'm a documentary historian, and it's based on evidence. And it have to have the evidence, so it's very limited. And my particular interest is the 1820s and 30s with Ryerson. And I see the injustice being that from a narrative historian's point of view, it's just, unfortunately, not set up as I would like it. I did the 2 books, and I'm by no means an expert. My gig at all, COVID, this was very torturous, but when all this business was happening and the decapitation the time of the cutting the head off the statue and all that. I got quite involved. So really, if you want to know where I stand, it's the article. And it's the modern digital age, the article's on the web. So that's the real deal. So what's going to follow is really just touch upon the major points. But my article, Egerton Ryerson and Mississauga, Appeal for Future Research, is still the name, the game, as I see it. And I finished. I can't get it all. And my study really is based on the 1820s and 30s and early 1840s. What I see about Ryerson is very clear. I see, well, let's not go into the religious side, because we're in a post-Christian age, and this is a different period. And our evaluation of his missionary contribution is understandably mixed. But I think if we look at his positive contributions in the non-religious area, they are very impressive. And there are three of them, which I would, and again, repeating my article. But really what the first one is, the literacy. Because in the school, you've got sort of the ground, Lynn's given you some framework, thank heavens. He's there for a year and a half, and they're already Christian when he comes there. Whatever that means, I don't know what, that's a big heavy duty, this is deep waters, I don't do that. But anyways, he comes there and they set a school up, and the intent is to teach in a Ojibwe, put it into a written form, and English. So they're bilingual schools. I think that's terrific. He sends, other Methodist schools are this way. I think that's a real contribution. Secondly, agricultural training. We have to remember this is an agricultural age. It's so different than today. And the important thing is to learn how to farm. And Egerton is very concerned about that because he wants the people to stand up and be able to stand and argue back. English, an economic base. What more can you ask? And then you come to the big one, land. Land. And thanks, Lynn, you covered that for me. He argues for, well, land rights, in this case, the mouth of the Credit River. Today's Mississauga, 4,000 acres. A title deed. Peter Jones, the leader, has already asked for it. Peter Jones and Egerton are blood brothers. It's very close. Ever since that year at the Credit, they've just become bonded together and they support each other. So that is very impressive to me because when you look at this land question, in the United States, Andrew Jackson is pushing ahead the removal policy. And that's when the Cherokees and the other civilized tribes are pushed west of the Mississippi. And that's the Trail of Tears. 1/4 of the Cherokees perish in this forced expulsion from Georgia and the Carolinas to west of the Mississippi. So, hats off Egerton for literacy, agricultural training, and land. Here's my thesis. Egerton and the Methodists worked, I'm going to say all the Methodists, because it's a varied crew, naturally, as anything is in life. But Egerton's idea was, once they got on their feet, they could protect themselves. That's the way I see it. And it was badly needed. The Mississaugas had been devastated over the previous 40 years. In fact, in this neighborhood, their head chief was murdered. Wabakanini. Just maybe a couple blocks away. And there's a Toronto Heritage plaque now. They're very well stated. Darren Wabinga, the cultural heritage person at New Credit, the Mississaugas of the Credit, he's done the text, and it's very good. So what happened? Egerton, let's get some context. Egerton walks into a community that's been devastated by this. The heritage chief's murder, and their only friend is this guy called David Ramsey, who's an Indian trader, and he's just a horrible guy, and he writes some petitions for them, but they're in terrible shape. 40% or over half of them have perished in a generation by the 1820s. They're down to about 200 people. So they lost 60% of the people. They're devastated by this intrusions in their hunting territory. Their fisheries are not respected. It's just a free fall. So Egerton's, he's there for a year. He learned the language, but he never could do sermons. And that's a tough stuff. You take that Ojibwe, boy, I understand, but it's a real tough language. All the First Nations are, because there are no bridges with English. But he did due diligence. He learned how to communicate in the native language, and he wanted them to protect themselves. Now, what the bad news is, it was unsuccessful because, thank you, Lynn, thank you. She's told about Lord Guelph. The idea of title deeds was conceded, but it was never implemented. So, and it doesn't work because when that letter, and please, all I can say is don't call it a report. It's a letter, and he takes 2 months to write it. He's asked for an opinion, and I mean, he's really a good guy to do it because it's not his portfolio. He has no responsibility in the mid-1840s for First Nations. He has none. So why? That's the part that gets me sort of boiled up. Now, all that being said, I'll say it at the end. I'll keep that to the end. But what? Unfortunately, Egerton now is involved in the school system, and Paul's reviewed that, and Patrice has told us all the other angles to Egerton, which are many. The problem is that the First Nations population continues to decline because of massive immigration. And by 1850, they are 1% of the population. So they're just off the. There's no pressure to do things for them. And the ultimate is 1847, when the letter is written. The worst comes to fruition. They have to leave the credit. So Toronto will have no Indigenous community next to it. Unlike Calgary, Calgary does. And now, the Tsutsina or Sarsi, they retained their land base right to the west of Calgary. Now, they have control of their lands. I mean, it's because of the new constitution and all. And they are the new, this is a bit, giving public talk, but to me, I see them as the new Abu Dhabi. Because on the Calgary Ring Road, by the reserve, there's the busiest Costco in Canada, and a bank, there's a casino, there's a hotel, and there's plans for hundreds of housing units, but the Tsutsina retain ownership. It's on a lease basis. So that could have been here. I mean, now that'll be 2 days talk on that one. You only get 1 minute because I can't go any further. My time's old, so. And, well, this is it. Let's do the tie-up here. Well, yes, social Darwinism. Nobody's mentioned that so far. We've got this, Patrice has touched upon enlightenment and all, the ability of everyone to rise up and be equal and stuff. Well, social Darwinism was total inequality. It's inferior and superior races. This is dominant at the turn of the century. That is when that letter is brought forward. That's another story. Lynn's covered it. Now, all this, in the end, I just see Egerton Ryerson as an admirable person who stands up, he sees injustice in 1820s and 1830s, and says something. That's all.
So we broke the microphone stand, we had dogs barking, children crying. I felt like I was at home. All right. Patrice, you should come over here. Okay, so it's caught around the post. I'm going to break something else. Thank you for accident prevention, health and safety. All right, so we do have a little bit of time for conversation. We've obviously had a number of very learned talks up front here on a whole host of aspects of the issue, but we'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to hear what you have to think about, what you want to know from these people, or your own thoughts. So I'm conscious that this is going to be recorded online. So if you want to ask your question, and I might just repeat a version of it here so that the people who are watching this at home can pick it up. But please, if there are any questions, yeah.
I'm interested in Ryerson's prospective syllabus for his day school and the industrial school, that idea. And I'm wondering, I once heard Murray Sinclair grumble about that because there was no provision for what you might call an enriched stream that would allow Indigenous people to advance to higher levels of society. Nothing about learning Latin or other academic subjects.
All right, so what would have been on the Ryerson school that he envisioned and that was an enriched stream?
Yeah, I'll take that. What we know about the school that he envisioned was it was very much Philip von Fallenberg's version of the school, the Hofwell School. And it was really one stream. So I think there's some truth to that. It was for the poor children. And it was designed to kind of raise them all up. And that was to advance them all. So I guess if you were looking at it from the point of view of, was it segmented or not? But I think given the fact that it was designed in that period, because I've studied, actually my doctoral thesis was called Little Worlds. And it covered Indian schools, in residential schools, and special institutions for children in Ontario, 1850 to 1930. That was my doctoral thesis. So going back, I can tell you there were a lot of other examples, but that was the one that he's took. But consider this, it was considered the most progressive educational program on offer at the time.
So Murray Sinclair, of course, went all the way to the Supreme Court, so we would ask that question.
Probably.
Okay, I'll just come back. I'll go one more over there and then down here.
Thank you. Something that wasn't mentioned today that I'd be interested in some clarification. I've read that there was a meeting in July 1846 at which the chiefs met with Ryerson and that they actually requested industrial schools. I don't know if I've got it right, but I'd like some clarification.
So the question is about whether there's a meeting where the local chiefs requested industrial schools. Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
The council minutes there are 1846 council minutes. I'd have to check. I don't think Ryerson's there. He's got no responsibility for it. I mean, but you're right. The chiefs call for the schools. I mean, these are resilient people. And some of them don't go for it, but a number do. And of course, Peter Jones and John Sunday that's his ally at Alderville. So I'm sorry, just to answer the question, I don't think Ryerson was there, so we can't hold him up on that. But the idea is it's coming from the leadership. The First Nations realize what they're in.
I'll add one thing. We do know from Shing Walk's vision, which some of you will have read, which is J.D. Miller's book on the origins of Indigenous schools. We do know that, and I've researched the Shing Walk School. It's one of the ones I studied, along with a few of the others. In every case, the chiefs were the initiators of the schools because they were looking to educate their own children to be chiefs. So they saw these schools as being a way of advancing them. Now, that's the first generation. The second generation tended to be more critical, and they realized that it wasn't exactly serving the needs. But if you go back to J.R. Miller, which is the best-known book on the subject, it's called Shing Walk's Vision. That's the name of the school in Sault Ste. Marie, Garden River. It goes into incredible detail about how much they wanted the Anglican Church to take responsibility for this.
Okay, a question up front.
It was mentioned just a while back by one of you. I know you work and you're terrific at that, and all of a sudden I forget your name. I only apologize.
Patrice.
Render stuff with it. Is you mentioned that all the parts to the Ryerson statue, Ryerson has it. Is that for sure? And so, what did that happen?
Repeat the question, please.
Yes. Clarification, does Ryerson, does TMU really have all the parts to the statue?
Ryerson is very cagey. The answer is that Ryerson's very cagey about it for reasons I do not understand, except perhaps that they are being cautious and they don't want anybody to know where the parts are.
Please,
The mic.
What, more? Louder?
just speak.
Louder? Okay, sorry, I will repeat that. My last communication with the authorities at TMU, asking them if they had the parts, was this. Yes, they do. They won't tell me where it is. I think it's out of security concerns. But that being said, I'm very concerned that once there is a succession and people forget about the statue, that it will wind up being melted or somebody will make room for it because they need space. So I think it's incumbent, it'll be 5 years soon since the thing was destroyed. Now, the plinth, apparently, which was a beautiful plinth, the original plinth, Again, when was it created? 1880s? I don't remember. Sometime in the 1880s. The Ryerson statue went up in the late 1880s, and the original plinth was still there. Apparently that was destroyed. I don't know about that. But either way, there are people who can restore these things. Plinths can be rebuilt. They can be newly built. And there's ample time now because Queen's Park is undergoing a renovation. And this is the moment to put pressure on the government to make room for that statue to be rebuilt.
Just another point on that. Friends of Egerton Ryerson, Ron Stagg is drafting a letter to the Toronto Reference Library that could be perhaps an intermediate place for the statue, so it would be inside, and so it would not have to have the same kind of security. But obviously, it should be outside in a prominent place. Queen's Park would be very good, but we are going to move on that in terms of a request. But we need to get people who use the Toronto Public Library system to speak up that Ryerson is worthy of being memorialized there with a statue.
And the Ryerson head was last seen on a documentary in TVO on Tom Wilson, and it shows him playing down at Caledonia that was taken over by the Mohawk warriors, and he is singing with the head behind him.
Well, when was that, Bruce? When was it? When did that happen?
A couple of weeks afterwards.
It was since you and it was before you and I were down there
Oh, okay.
on that same property.
Okay, we've got lots of questions. We've got one at the very back and then one over here.
I was wondering, since you have this crowd of very interested people, and you've convinced us of your points, what do you think we should be doing either collectively or individually to make sure that it is corrected?
What should we be doing? What's your advice?
I got involved with this group when we were debating what to do about Ryerson, and I made the statement that it would be a move to write to the Premier and to the Minister of Education to ask for a moratorium on the changing of all names. And everyone on this panel supported that, and all of these organizations supported it, and that's essentially what's happened. You see what they've done with the school boards. They've kind of put a moratorium on it. The argument was this: if you stop it from happening, it creates the space where we can have discussions like this about whether it was the right decision in the first place. And I agree with Lynn, though. There's certain things you don't want to undo that aren't worth undoing. But the moratorium idea carried. And I think if you look at what was announced this week, it was essentially that let's put a stop on this. And the status quo is better than nothing. But I think the bigger issue is, have we reached a tipping point or a turning point where there'll be more decisions in our favor? Vis-a-vis what we would do, I gave you 4 recommendations for improvements. I think first, number one, my strongest view is stand up and be counted in favor of Ryerson and as the founder of the school system. Secondly, take a look at all the monuments that exist and see that they're properly restored and changed. Challenge Parks Canada. I wrote a piece in the Hub about them changing all the statues and the plaques. Have them changed, and then finally, move into where would Ryerson, should he be restored? And Lynn made her suggestion. My view is it should be at Queen's Park. I think there should be one there, absolutely. And then other places that he actually contributed to in a broader cultural sense. And my last thing is this: if you're a teacher or you're a former teacher, look into what's being taught in the schools, because we need to restore a narrative. This is one narrative that's lost. This is one huge narrative about the school system itself. Well, that's a narrative that should be better known, and there are many others. Macdonald, Dundas, we know all those. So that's my 4 recommendations.
Okay, right here, yeah.
Yes, Lynn said that she wasn't sure if any of the industrial schools were established. And my question is, was the model farm on the new credit associated with Ryerson?
Was the model farm on the new credit associated with Ryerson?
I don't know about on the new credit, but there was actually 6 acres in downtown Toronto where the education department was, and that included an experimental farm, which was the basis that moved to the Ontario Agricultural College at the University of
I'm
Guelph.
referring to the model farm that was offered by the Ojibwe themselves.
I don't know about a model farm there. And Ryerson helped people learn farming because he knew how to do it. So he helped them. I've never heard of it being a model farm, but they were individual farms.
Thanks for the question. To my knowledge, there were 2 schools created, and they were very short-lived because students couldn't afford to go there, or they weren't interested in showing up, and they both failed. So I think they were set up in the 1850s.
There was 2 of them, Annick at Alderville and Mount Elgin at Munsey Town. One of them was very short, but one of them lasted a long time. But they deteriorated.
Yes, but either way, they didn't survive for very long. So the short answer is, in response to Ryerson's recommendations in 1846, that 4-page letter, 2 schools were set up, but they didn't last for very long.
I don't think that Ryerson's letter goes in, well, I mean, like, it's really so vague. He wants, I'm sorry, I guess we have to fight this one out ourselves here. He got no responsibility for Indian residential, for Indian education. He's got his hands full as it is. But I just want to say this is my chance because we're getting near the end, and I wanted to say something more, just 1 minute, honestly. I really will take 1 minute only. I am very sympathetic to the First Nations. They were I mean, the pain is unbelievable. For 200 years being told you're inferior, substandard, it's appalling, and by any standards. And now I've got the first suspicion has come early this year and continues on now with Mr. T in the South telling us we're not a country, we have no history, we should just be the 51st state. I mean, that's a peanut compared to what First Nations have gone through. So I think it's just, that's got to be said. And the sensitivity is 100% there. I'm really totally sensitive. So when I talk about this, I'm just making it so restricted because I think the anxiety and the poor water and the health conditions, I mean, these are the original peoples and the territorial acknowledgements, that's a turning point. We're getting to know that we are darn lucky to be here.
John Smith's second book, which is wonderful.
We're really here to sell you books. I have one. More than one. Okay. Question here.
I just had a quick question about Shinwa, and I know he snowshoed down to Toronto to raise money for his school. And I know Alexander Wood was also trying to raise funds for a school. Were they working in the same organization to raise money, or did it do Alexander Wood?
This is going back a long ways. You
It's like 1830s, I think.
Yes, but I didn't really research him. I know all about the Anglican missionaries that founded it and how they negotiated with Chief Shinwa, but I don't really know a lot about that. But I will say, let me just support Don, what Don said. Anybody that's read anything I've written about Indigenous peoples, like why we need to incorporate them into the curriculum, why it isn't being taught properly, I think most of us share that. But, you have to separate issues out and treat them with the respect that they deserve for the historical record. That's what we're talking about. But, myself too, if you look at some of my publications, you'll see I'm very sympathetic. I work for the Northern Policy Institute, and I wrote papers on Indigenous schools. So a lot of us have that feeling, and that's why we're drawn to something we see as an injustice. It's just not fair, the way he's been treated.
Okay, I think I think we're at our time. We probably do one more question. You're right there. Yeah.
How is it that this historical reference, which you all are so expert on, has been so conflated and has become a rallying point for the kind of sympathy you're talking about, but completely distorted and takes revenge on a gentleman who in his era was actually heroic?
I think my summary of that was, why is what you were saying so different from the popular narrative? That's a good question.
My report deals with it. It's 50 pages, so of course it deals with a lot of things. But it deals with the presentism that pervades our society. That is, we judge everything on the basis of the present. There's not a whole lot of acknowledgement of what came before, and there is maybe not any appreciation for it. So you're dealing with the present moment, and you are responding specifically to events like a nationwide story about the 215 dead bodies that were never discovered in Canada, right? And so it's all made within the context of that. Interestingly enough, if you look at all these decisions, they're made in the heat of the moment in response to some very specific reaction and people who are looking for a quick answer to that. So I think it's the larger issue I address in a lot of my writings about the death of narrative. And that if you don't have a story to tell, somebody can come and replace it.
I would like to echo that. This is related to the fact that in Ontario, in Canada, we do not teach history. We do not teach history. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
We do not teach history. That in this country, only 3 provinces require a Canadian history credit to graduate high school. And they are Ontario, Manitoba, and Quebec. In other jurisdictions, you can take a course in civics or in studies, quote unquote studies, and that's fine, but that's not history. History is the discipline of learning cause and consequence, of learning sequence, of learning about events and how forces shape events. We have collectively in Canada lost that ability, and it's not recent. We have abandoned narrative. We have abandoned history for at least 2 generations now. I'm old enough, and I'm the youngest one here, I took grade 13 history, and it was Canadian history, and it was wonderful. But that doesn't exist. Grade 13 history doesn't exist. And then again, in Ontario, we do have a Canadian history credit, and that matters a great deal. But for the rest of the country, it doesn't matter. I also want to take a kick at the media. Okay, the legacy media. I'm not going to talk about social media because that's a crime on its own. But the legacy media. Look at the leads on the CBC and the Toronto Star when the Ford government announced that it was going to remove the boxes around Sir John A. Macdonald. The leads in both cases, this is going to make the Indigenous population very angry. Right off the bat, there is an issue of creating a duality. And that's wrong. Memorialization is not a zero-sum game. Just because we want to honor Egerton Ryerson, it doesn't mean that we are disrespecting the Indigenous people.
Correct.
There's room for everybody in our memory. And we need to remind our leaders of that, whether it's the school board, who have their own political agenda, or the provincial governments, or in fact the federal government, which has been at the source of all this. It is not a zero-sum game. So let's remember everybody, and I think we'd be a lot better off that way, and perhaps a lot more peaceful.
Here, here.
Fitting last words that are not going to be the last words. But I maybe before we let's ask for a big round of applause for our speakers today. And you've heard too much from me, but the person in the back asked the question of what you could do, and can I give one little suggestion, which is very practical and maybe very helpful. There's a tray up here if you want to make a donation to the organizations that are so pivotally important in fighting these fights and in fostering these kinds of discussions. I think they would really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. My name is John Parker. I'm a member of the board of the Canadian Institute for Canadian Institute for Historical Education. That's who we are. So grateful to everyone for participating today. Grateful to all of you for attending. Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said in one of his discussions, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts." And I think if there's one thing that unites everybody in this room here, is that it's important to us that we begin by getting our facts straight. We seem to live in a day and age where we lead with our feelings and we form our opinions, and then we backfill with the facts that suit us. And we've even seen in far too many cases where the facts get invented, and then they become the understanding that infects the knowledge and understanding of others who want to participate. What we're all about is trying to get the facts right. So thank you all for being part of that exercise. And let me thank in particular Lynn McDonald, Donald B. Smith, Patrice Dutil, and Christopher Dummitt for being on our panel today. Paul Bennett for being the mastermind behind the whole thing, leading us off with the opening comments. Rose Dyson and Carolyn Edgar from the Friends of Egerton Ryerson. Patrice, we'll have a talk about that when we get a chance. But as the United Church member up here, I claim, and Lynn's with me on this, I claim some credentials on that point.
You have it.
And thanks to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the Friends of Egerton Ryerson, and the Canadian Institute for Historical Education for putting all of this together. Most of all, thanks to all of you for being here today. And as Chris says, people always come up and says, "Can I give you money?" Well, the answer is, well, of course you can. And there's a plate here who will take it. And we'll see to it that it gets well taken care of. Other than that, if you want us to keep in touch with you, you want to keep in touch with us, make sure your name and email address is on the sign-up sheet here. It's at the front desk now. And what's that? Oh, Rose knows more about upcoming events than I do, so I'm going to hand this to Rose to tell you about 2 events to know about.
Okay, well, if you want to know more about Egerton Ryerson, on the 21st of June, we're having an examination of his contributions to journalism. Lynn is going to be leading that discussion, so do come out. It's a Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock, at Deer Park Library, and I think you know where that is. It's approximately in St. Clair. And then we're going to have another one in the fall with Reverend Peter Hewitt, who's had a change of heart about Ryerson. He has done more research than he had, I guess, 3 years ago, and is now talking about many of the same things we are. So that's another possibility on the 21st of September, again at Deer Park Library. Same time, 2 o'clock.
Thanks, Rose. And if there's any specific request that I would like to close with is, don't let it end with this. By all means, carry the word forward, keep in touch with us, and let's keep this process going forward. You'll be surprised at how many people say, by golly, glad somebody's doing that. Keep up the good work. Thank you all.